All right, good afternoon, everyone. This is Keith Stelman with the National Weather Service of Peachtree City. We'll get through. I've got quite a bit to cover. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail for you today. Hopefully, it'll answer some of the questions that we've been getting about timing, etc. But this is briefing number 3 on Hurricane Helene, and today is go day for us. So let's talk about the main highlights. It is still expected to intensify to a Cat 3 over the Eastern Gulf this afternoon into the evening hours. There's a little bit of wiggle room there, but for the most part, I think most of the Hurricane Center has honed in on a Cat 3 in the Big Bend. The one thing that they point out, and they pointed out on the conference call that we had, was the sheer size of the wind field of this storm. It's a very large storm. It's on the upper end of the spectrum for hurricanes in terms of the wind field. And because of that, that's why we're seeing the large surge. That's why we're seeing the scope of the tropical storm force winds in the state, and why it's actually very important that we don't focus on the exact center line of the storm because the wind field is so large. And again, because of that, we are expecting an unprecedented event for north and central Georgia, given the track and given the size of the wind field, in addition to the storm maintaining intensity well inland once it makes landfall this evening into the northern part of the state. So some changes that we want to touch on from yesterday. The track has been, if you look at the fine details of it, it's waffling a little bit here or there by a county or two from last night to today. I think last night's forecast had it a little east of the Atlanta metro. The 10 a.m. or the 11 a.m. Forecast now has the point basically over top of the northwest Atlanta metro by 7 a.m. tomorrow morning as a tropical storm. But again, a lot of the impacts are going to be felt not only near the center, but well away from the center because of the large size of the storm itself. That includes tornadoes, that includes winds, that includes flooding and the rainfall, which we'll get into. The other aspect that's sort of notable and was brought up on the call was the intensity of the storm that's maintained well inland. So their 7 a.m. point, which has basically a point over northwest metro Atlanta, is 55 knot TS over northern Atlanta. So because of that maintenance of the TS well inland, obviously we're expecting impacts, particularly winds and power lines and trees, to be felt well inland all the way to the northern Georgia state line. Obviously, the only other thing was heavy rain. We saw some heavy rain yesterday. We're going to cover a little bit of what fell, but we are expecting that to really start to pick up today and continue all the way through the end of the event tomorrow. Obviously, that with what fell and what we're expecting, the flash flood threat is going to be at the highest levels that we've seen. And we'll, again, touch on that in a minute. So here is the latest NHC forecast for Helene as of 11 a.m. You see the storm, again, making landfall in the Florida Big Bend as a major hurricane. And as I alluded to on the last slide, there's the 7 a.m. point, which is, again, northwest metro Atlanta as a tropical storm. It is, again, while it is expected to weaken as it moves over land, because of how fast it's moving and because of other factors like interacting with the upper low and the placement compared to that upper low that's pulling it back to the northwest, it maintains its intensity further inland than many hurricanes of the past. So that's why this is falling into that unprecedented category that we mentioned on the previous slide. Here are the latest watches and warnings. The entire state is under at least a TS watch. The only changes, or a TS warning, sorry, tropical storm warning. The only changes we made were a hurricane warning extended slightly further north to Lamar and Monroe counties along I-75. And that's really, I mean, give or take, and a lot of the issues are going to be with potential hurricane force wind gusts. It doesn't mean that we won't see them further north, but our highest confidence is in that region where you see here, and it is along and just to the east of the center. In fact, the center track almost follows the dots you see here, Maracus, Butler, Thomaston, Griffin, and then right up over Atlanta. So it'll be along and just east of the center. Once it gets further up towards the metro, that we could potentially see some close to hurricane force wind gusts out of the storm. One thing that was brought up on the call is that, again, because of the other factors, maintaining intensity well inland and interaction with the upper low, the hurricane center is running a little bit higher gust factor with the storm well inland. And so with any of the bands and the rain shield, the gusts might be a little stronger than typical. And so that's what we're kind of highlighting here with the hurricane warning so far inland. So looking at the satellite and radar, you can see the latest satellite on the right. The storm has struggled to at least define a real defined center on satellite presentation. It's convection as it's getting north. It's running out of time a little bit as it's traversing north, but deepened and the pressure has continuously fallen over the last 24 hours. We're down around the 960 mil, but it may be in part due to the fact that it's a very large center, and it is harder for storms with the large center to wrap up and rapidly intensify. But there is still along the Naples latitude has a long way to go across water before it gets to the coast. On the left-hand side, you can see the radar, and you'll see the intensity of the rain picking up from the south, particularly down in the Tallahassee and the Panhandle region. But you'll notice maybe from, say, just north of Albany, stretching across Macon, there's maybe some banding that's starting to set up. And then if you look up across the 85 corridor up through the metro, there is a little bit heavier precip setting up. Some of the models are starting to hint at that region becoming rainfall over the next 12 to 18 hours. And so we're going to be watching rain in that sector for potential increase in flash flood risk. And we'll talk about that briefly as well. So I'm going to turn over to Laura. She's going to talk about the rainfall and the flooding aspect.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. This slide is mostly including rainfall amounts that have already occurred so far across the area. You can see that there's a higher axis of amounts there from the Abbeville up into Louisville area, and a lot of that did fall this morning as those area of showers move through there. On the whole, the high amounts here have been upwards of 2 inches, maybe above 4 inches down in that southeast area. So this has really primed us for this second wave of heavier rainfall that we're expecting here in the next 24 hours. I will caution you real quickly on these amounts that are shown on the table on the left. Some of these are not Weather Service quality controlled, so there are a few that appear to be unrepresentative, like the Noonan location there, but the Louisville, that's 6.5 inches in Louisville area, that's probably correct. So just kind of a caveat there. Now, as we move forward to the next slide, as I mentioned, we've got this next wave of rain expected to come through. Our chance of seeing at least 4 inches of rainfall or more now is, 70, 80, 90% across a good portion of the area. The farther northeast you go into northeast Georgia, the higher that probability is. There is still the potential that we could see isolated upwards of 8 inches. And so I just want to add that. But we are continuing to monitor how this additional rainfall will really compound the flooding risk that we're seeing across the area. And then for those of you who are looking for more specifics for your counties, you'll see that basically across the board, at least 4 to 6 inches across most of the county warning area there on the map on the right. Now, I will say the Weather Prediction Center has collaborated with us this morning and has extended the high risk area. So that's a 70% chance of seeing flash flooding occurring within 25 miles of any point in that kind of high, bright pink area there on the left. And so that's a good portion of the metro Atlanta area, northeast Georgia, and a large area of responsibility that we cover. So we are still expecting this to be an unprecedented flooding event. Here in the office, we're throwing around past events like the Christmas 2015 floods and the September '09 floods as far as the increased coverage of flooding. We have seen a slight adjustment downward so that maybe on the large scale, it's a lower intensity of flooding, so fewer locations with major flooding expected on our main stem rivers. We're going to kind of hone on this and reiterate this potentially is a life-threatening flash flooding situation. So we want to make sure people are comfortable looking on our water.noaa.gov website for water information, and that they have those WIA alerts turned on as well. Just quickly to point out here some of the changes, you'll notice that the magenta points that we had very isolated across the map there yesterday, those have come down. And so we're expecting those locations to be more in the moderate range. But otherwise, you can see that for most of the state, we're expecting a lot of these main stem rivers to get to at least minor flooding, if not moderate or isolated major flooding. And again, this is not fully capturing those really flashy headwater points or maybe those small creeks and streams that we wouldn't consider main stem. So this is where I turn it back over to Keith.
Thank you, Laura. Let's go on to timing for winds. Get a lot of questions about when can you expect. So I've zoomed in on, and I'm using the NHC guidance since the models are a little hard to depend on, at least, but they give us a good estimate. But we'll stick to the NHC forecast for the most likely time of arrival for tropical storm force winds. Overlaid there is the probability of tropical storm force winds. And obviously with time, and Dave alluded to this in the last couple of briefings, and confidence, the tropical storm force wind probabilities have increased all the way up into the Atlanta metro and the I-20 corridor to greater than 90% probability of tropical storm force winds. And this is going to be based on sustained winds and not necessarily the gusts. But you can see Thursday around 9 p.m., the line on the graphic coming into the southern part of the state and basically approaching the southern part of our county warning area down near Americus and Cordele, over into the southeast, Vidalia, etc. So if we start down there around Albany, most likely looks like 9 p.m. I have midnight written on here. Should be 9 p.m. But around 9 p.m. Moving north, Columbus to Macon, it's roughly around midnight for most likely time of arrival. Doesn't mean we can't see a gust or two if there's any banding that comes in a little ahead of the main system. But roughly around midnight for those tropical storm force winds. And then up into the metro around 3 a.m. or so for the most likely time of arrival for the southern part of the metro. So around 3 a.m. Up into the northwest, you're looking at 8 a.m. or so for the most likely time of arrival for TS winds tomorrow morning, 8, 9 a.m., somewhere in that time frame in the far northwest. And so obviously with the arrival of the main center, it's going to be closely tied to these times when the main center is approaching, since the winds are going to be largely confined to near the center. And I'll show that in a minute with what it probably will look like on radar. So if we use this model and don't follow the exact model, and I'll talk about this towards the end, because there's obviously a little bit of difference between what a model is showing for the track and what the Hurricane Center has as the official track. But if you take the representation as it is, sort of project where the center is and what the radar may look like. So we'll start at 8 p.m. tonight. There is a potential for tornadoes in the southeast. I'll cover that in a minute with a severe threat. But some of these cells coming in off the coast and any bands will be coming in. Actually, through the day today, there's already a tornado watch in the southeast part of the state. These bands will be rolling in, and the tornado threat will exist as long as the storm is to our south. And the bands are feeding in off the Atlantic. there will be a tornado threat. What Laura was alluding to with the rainfall and the high risk potential, you see this band that's extending from the northwest part of the state back into the southwest part of the state. It's going to orient itself basically on a north-south, and as the hurricane comes up, this band remains sort of semi-permanent during the duration of the hurricane passing. And because of that, the heavy rainfall axis may set up here, and we could see a little bit heavier, at least the potential for heavier rainfall would exist in that band as it's setting up through that region. The other thing to note is the strongest winds, maybe some of these bands rolling into the southern part of the state, just ahead of the main center. We'll start to see some of those stronger winds approaching from the south. And again, we mentioned the tropical storm force winds. This would be about the time they're getting into the Albany area potentially. Moving on to the next slide. Oops. 11 p.m. First, talk about the tornado potential. This is what I'm talking about. Some of these bands coming in and into the southeast, in maybe as far as Dublin or so. We'll have to watch for the tornado potential with those. The rain axis that I pointed out on the last slide, there it is, setting up again, back up over the metro. So all the rain today, all the way through 11 p.m. tonight, and probably increasing intensity based on what this particular model and what some of the things we're looking at would suggest. Rainfall picks up in intensity in that band set up in the 85 corridor. The other thing is the hurricane force winds would probably be entering the southern part of the state, most notably right around the ring of the center of the storm as it's coming ashore sometime late this evening. The other thing I want you to take note in, and this is why we were talking about the wind field being so expansive, if you just notice just from this model, the sheer size of the span of the storm itself. And if you consider this like an extension of the eye wall itself, that's a pretty wide expansion. And so any wiggle one county or the other really isn't going to make much difference in the exact track of this because of how large this wind field is. And again, it goes back to why we think this is going to be an unprecedented event for a large part of the state, simply because of how large it is. All right, so fast forward to 2 a.m. Here's the storm in the southern part of the state. Again, the tornado potential still exists in the southeast part of the state through 2 a.m. with some of these bands rolling in. It will begin to shift a lot more into South Carolina. The radar would indicate there's some pretty strong cells coming ashore, which we may have to watch rotating into the eastern part of the state. But for the most part, again, the southeast part of the state. Rain axis, still there. We may be starting to shift some of the heavy rain up into the higher terrain, but the rain axis does still exist, particularly across the western part of the state and along the northwestern flank of the center of the storm. So this is where the model starts to differ a little bit from the Hurricane Center forecast. And I just want to point that out because it's, if the model thinks the hurricane's here, but the Hurricane Center thinks it's here, you almost have to take what you see and shift it back to the west a little bit. But those nuances we aren't going to know necessarily until it actually comes ashore and we get some confidence in where the exact track is. And again, I'll point out the sheer size of the rain shield associated with the center, and it's very northern heavy. This is typical of a lot of hurricanes I've experienced in my career. Once it comes ashore, the southern side sort of gets dry slotted, and a lot of the action really occurs on the northern sector, northwestern sector, and particularly the strongest winds on the eastern sector. So your strongest winds are going to be contained right here. And if we're going to say this is when a lot of the power outages and trees are going to start to come down, it'll be heaviest in this sector when the center of the storm and this starts to move into your region. It doesn't mean that they won't happen and some of these bands are moving in, but this is when the biggest dose of it's going to be, is when this thing's coming in. Clear this, move on. I think I jump ahead to 8 a.m. Yeah, I do. So just project it north. The center, and again, this is why I was cautioning you of the center. The center of this is well east of the metro. So the storm itself, according to the Hurricane Center, would be around this time northwest metro and here. So Obviously, those differences are going to make a little bit of difference on where the strongest winds are and the strongest wind gusts. But what we're seeing in some of the model guidance is even with the strongest winds being in this part of the storm, there is some wrap around on the back side where the strong northwest winds are going to shift in once the center passes. So again, we still have our heavy rain axis, and we have winds shifting out of the west and northwest on the back side of the storm as it passes by through the early morning hours tomorrow. All right, so let me clear these. So that's 8 a.m. I think that was my last one. Yep. So max wind gust potential. This is straight out of our forecast packages. So anywhere in the purple, obviously we're looking at potential for max wind gusts in the Cat 3 range or greater than 100. Anywhere in the red, which basically confide or looks at or pretty close alignment with our hurricane warning area, is where we see the potential for wind gusts in that hurricane force range. Anything in orange, you're in that upper tropical storm force wind gust intensity. And then anything in yellow is where there's potential for tropical storm force wind gusts anywhere from 39 to 57, which basically encompasses the entire state. So other thing I want to point out is the area highlighted in red, because the storm maintains intensity well inland, and we're still teetering on the confidence with that and how much wind gust will exist with the storm as it's well into North Georgia. There is a potential for 58 to 73 wind gusts up in this sector on the northern part of the state, especially up in the mountains and the higher elevations where the winds are going to be higher off the surface. So I would say the confidence is a lot higher up here, but in general, this area will need to watch for that potential for some higher wind gusts with the storm as it's passing by in the latter part of the overnight hours. One thing of note, and we've seen this with every hurricane, peak winds are going to be very periodic, up and down. They're not going to be continuous. They'll be largely contained in the bands and then the solid range shield that precedes the center of the storm. But at the end of the day, very high risk for a lot of down trees and power lines. And we're still anticipating widespread and extended power outages as a result of the, again, sheer size and scope of the hurricane and the tropical storm force winds themselves through the course of the night. All right, just touch on this, the severe threat. This is from the Storm Prediction Center. You can see they do have an enhanced risk barely touching our southeastern counties, with the slight risk coming back as far as Sandersville to Dublin, and again to the east of the Cordell region. This will be primarily in the risk of tornadoes, with those outer feeder bands rolling in from the east and off the Atlantic. So you folks down in the southeast, you keep your heads up for potential for tornado, fast moving within the feeder bands that roll in through 2 a.m. tonight or so, before the storm finally gets north of you. Once the storm gets north of you, that threat really diminishes as the winds shift around to the east and the west and the southwest. All right. So last thing I'm going to talk about is the timing of the winds, the stronger winds exiting. If we just use a model for reference, when the winds get the wind gusts, this is wind gusts. Here is if the hurricane is up, in the exiting into Tennessee by about 11 a.m. These winds that you see on the screen are going to be out of the west and northwest and gusty. But you'll see exiting now on the southern part of the county warning area, we're starting to get down in the lower 30s for the wind gust. And so you're sort of in that all clear by late morning. If we go ahead one slide to 2 hours later, bump it up, you'll see that 35 line shift up into the I-20 corridor. So you start to get all clear south of I-20 around 1 p.m. or so. And then by 3 p.m., except in the higher terrain, we should be relatively below the 35 threshold for winds. The higher terrain may be an exception, but for the most part, winds generally out of the west in the 30-mile-an-hour range. One thing I want to point out is going back to around here, as the storm is passing, there's going to be places where the wind direction is blowing in basically everything, and then it's going to abruptly come back out around out of the northwest, and it'll be strongest right after that change happens. That abrupt change in wind direction, we've seen this before, could cause impacts in terms of adding to the power outage and the down tree issues, because all the trees are being blown in one direction and then they turn around and get blown in the other. So they may get weakened in one direction and then blown down as the wind changes and blows in the other. So keep that in mind as it's passing, that anything that was weakened by the winds blowing in one direction, as the storm's passing on the backside of it, even though it may not be raining, you're getting northwest winds, there is a danger to those weakened trees with that west and northwest wind blowing out of the west until the exit of the wind gusts. All right. So in summary, the last slide, again, we expect Cat 3 over the Gulf this afternoon. Unprecedented event for north central Georgia with a lot of power outages and down trees, in addition to the flood threat. And I think that just about wraps it up. I'll leave it here because I'm about to cough, and open it up for any questions. While we're asking any questions, I will stop the recording.